I do want to bring in Mariam Wahba, research analyst at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, to talk more about all of this and the trip by President Trump here over to Egypt and then to Israel. Mariam, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Great to be with you this morning, Josh.
All right, so first off, the big question that a lot of people are asking, and I'm hoping that you can maybe provide some clarity here, is what exactly it means by President Trump heading over to Egypt and then to Israel, and if that is still the case.
Absolutely. Look, we're in a historic moment as President Trump, Bibi Netanyahu, and Hamas have announced this ceasefire agreement. We are 24 months into a brutal war that started with Hamas's October 7th massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians and taking more than 250 hostages. More than 40 of them are still in Gaza today. More than half are still living and half are deceased. They have been murdered by Hamas. The president heading over to the Middle East is surely significant. We've seen President Donald J. Trump push for the ceasefire and want it at different points in the last few months since he took office. And he has communicated clearly what this means for him personally, for his legacy, and we know just how much the hostages have meant to him. So to secure a deal just one day after the second anniversary of the October 7th attack is momentous for him and for the Israeli people and for the American public. We're going to see 20 plus hostages, alive ones, returned to Israel in the coming days, maybe even hours. And that is going to be a pivotal moment for the Israeli public. These hostages have been the pain point at the center of this war for the last 24 months. Now, looking at the president potentially going to Egypt and Israel, I think he's trying to seal the deal. I think he's trying to put people's skins in the games. We know that the Qataris in Egypt have levers they can pull on Hamas to get them to accept this deal, which we see that happening. We're also seeing Turkey get involved in the ceasefire agreement. And I think by President Trump going to the region, he's trying to say, we need this to be followed through. This cannot fall through, and we have to hold Hamas's feet to the fire. And he's looking at Egypt and Qatar specifically to say, you have to make sure that the hostages are released and Hamas does not break the framework of this deal.
And Mariam, I'm hoping you can hang on here because we do have the Prime Minister of Israel's office spokesperson who's speaking right now about this. And I do want to lift up the audio here so that we can listen into some of those comments.
Phase. Tonight at 5 p.m. Israel time, there will be a cabinet meeting. And at 6 p.m. Israel time, there will be a government meeting taking place. Now, within 24 hours after the cabinet meeting takes place, a ceasefire will then begin in Gaza. The IDF will then redeploy to the yellow line as shown on maps, which have been widely distributed at this point in time. And now after this 24-hour period, the 72-hour time window will then begin, where all of our hostages will be released back into Israel. Now, the final draft of Phase 1 was signed this morning in Egypt by all parties to release all of the hostages. And the IDF will then redeploy to that yellow line we mentioned, which will lead to the military controlling and holding about 53% of the Gaza Strip. Now, Phase 1 stands very clear. All of our hostages, the living and deceased, will be released 72 hours later, which will bring us to Monday. Israel is preparing to receive our hostages in all conditions they may be in. This comes with the help from specialists and all main hospitals in Israel. They are ready with robust procedures that are in place. Israel is anticipating the handover of our hostages to be conducted with respect and decorum from Hamas, and will have no tolerance for our hostages to be paraded around like we have seen in the past. Hostages will then be transferred into the hands of specialized IDF forces. The great relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump is reflected in this plan. And we could not have reached this point without the magnificent relationship between the two of them. Everything between Washington and Jerusalem was in full coordination with each other, which was a strategy envisioned by the Prime Minister. And that's the end of our briefing today. Please put some of your questions in the chat right now so I can answer them as we go. So I'm receiving a question from Reuters. Has Israel formally signed the agreement? Has Hamas also signed it? I just mentioned in the briefing that the plan has been finalized this morning in Egypt. When will the ceasefire then come into effect? It will come into effect, of course, after the 24 hours take place that we discussed, after those meetings take place later this evening. Has Israel agreed or refused to release Palestinian prisoner Marwan Barghouti? I can tell you at this point in time that he will not be part of this release. Question from an independent broadcast journalist. I'm receiving about the 250 prisoners serving life sentences. In terms of that, it's a very difficult thing that Israel has to do. Many of these terrorists who are being released are convicted terrorists who have blood on their hands for murdering innocent Israelis. So from the Washington Post, could you please clarify the timeline for the coming days? So I did. You can rewind in this briefing. We discussed the meetings that will be taking place tonight, in addition to the timeline of the 24 hours and then the 72-hour window that will then go into effect. Many of these questions are about the timeline. So, like I reiterated, please go back into the briefing and make sure you're hearing the timeline very clearly as what I stated. Meetings taking place, then the 24 hours and the 72-hour window will then go into effect. In terms of the list of prisoners being finalized, we will have some more information that will be coming out later about that during the day. Someone asked, as journalists, are we allowed to go into Gaza freely now? Journalists have always been allowed into Gaza. I think journalists actually really need to recognize how dangerous the Gaza Strip is. There are homes, there are roads that are completely booby-trapped with explosives by a terror organization that is inside of the Gaza Strip at this point in time. We've continued to get this question, and the answer is yes, journalists are absolutely allowed inside of the Gaza Strip, but you have to understand the risk that comes with it. Let me just take a few more questions. From the Independent, what will the timeline be for aid delivery into the Gaza Strip? Let's get something very clear. Aid has always been going into the Gaza Strip from the beginning of this war until now. And of course, it has increased significantly in the last few weeks. Israel is committed to bringing humanitarian aid in. The problem is Hamas. Will this aid actually reach these populations that need it the most? You should ask Hamas that question. And in terms of the IDF redeployment map, I also want to refer you back to the map that was released. President Trump also released it as well, that yellow line where Israel will be pulling out to. Thank you all so much for your time. Like I said, a lot of the questions that are being asked are about the timeline, and we just cleared that up in this briefing. Please go back and take a listen to it. It's extremely important, and it will help your reporting as well. And let's be clear about something. This is an incredible success Prime Minister Netanyahu has been working so diligently at to get to this point in time. We know that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have this incredible relationship that also got us here, with the Prime Minister taking significant steps militarily and diplomatically to squeeze Hamas to get to this point in time where we can finally see the release of all 48 of our hostages, where some of them can be reunited with their families. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right. So, Mariam, thank you so much for sticking with us here. That was Shash Bedrosian. She is the newer spokesperson for Prime Minister Netanyahu there in Israel. Anything that stood out to you about what she had to say? Obviously, there were a few questions there, and they said the list of names not released just yet, that should be finalized later on today. What do you make of all of that?
There's a couple things that stand out to me from this briefing, and I think the Israeli government is really out there trying to make sure the Israeli public and the international media understands what this deal entails and setting itself up for success in the next 72 hours as the Israeli government votes on the ceasefire agreement, and then they look forward to the 72 hours that precede that in receiving their hostages. First and foremost, I think it's notable that the Israeli spokesperson noted that Marwan Barghouti will not be part of this release. That has been on the minds of many analysts here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, these ceasefire deals are mighty heavy for Israel because they end up having to release hundreds, if not thousands, of convicted terrorists and murderers out of their jails in order to get their hostages back. And looking at what that list entails is very important for these ceasefire agreements. And look, Josh, you and I have been speaking for the last 24 months as certain brief ceasefire deals have agreed, and we've seen the heavy price that Israel has to pay. So it is interesting that she noted that Marwan Barghouti will not be released as part of this deal. That's first. Second, the second most notable thing for me from that press briefing is the questions from the media about the timeline. We're seeing reporters be really diligent about asking, what does the next 24 hours look like? What does the next 72 hours look like? And the subcontext of those questions is that the ceasefire is quite fragile, as all ceasefires have in the last 24 months. And these early hours of the deal really determine what the success of a ceasefire deal looks like. Will Hamas hold up its side of the deal? Will the Arab states force its feet to the fire and make sure that the hostages are released under the subtext, under the certain conditions that was signed in that ceasefire deal? We've seen what hostage release ceremonies have looked like under Hamas. We've seen dead bodies, deceased bodies paraded around. The family, the Sharif family comes to mind, the Bibas family comes to mind first. So it's important to Israel that when hostages are released, there is dignity and respect for living and deceased.
And Mariam, I did want to ask you here about the situation as it does play out, because you heard during the briefing there that folks asked about journalists being able to go into Gaza. They've always been able to. We have seen folks that have gone in there. But your thoughts on whether a journalist really should be going into Gaza, especially right now?
This is a fascinating question. In my opinion, in my analysis, the Israelis have really been dealt a poor card. In any other war zone, there are certain standards that militaries have to uphold when letting journalists enter into war zones. And the Israeli government, the Israeli IDF, has seen an unfair questioning with regards to who it lets into Gaza. We have to remember that the Gaza Strip is a battle zone, one that is littered with Hamas militants, an active terrorist organization that is seeking to use human shields, that does use human shields, that operates out of schools and hospitals and underground tunnels. So the Israelis have a vested interest in making sure that journalists are not entering an active battle zone and potentially getting hurt. Fatal accidents do happen. And the Israelis have been invested in making sure that journalists are not putting themselves in a battlefield like that.
My last question here, as we do continue to kind of gather the details, again, all of this in flux, the one question I have for you, and it is a question that's been asked kind of time and time again, we are talking about a terrorist organization here. Is there any guarantee that they are going to hold up their end of the bargain here? And what happens if they don't?
I think the timing here is very critical. We are now 24 months into this brutal war. Hamas is losing. They are continuing to fight because they are operating within schools, tunnels, and buildings that they should not be operating within. I think where we should begin to understand the amount of pressure Hamas is under is looking at the surrounding Arab states and what kind of leverage they've been able to expend on Hamas as a terrorist organization. And if I were to take you back just a couple of days, perhaps maybe weeks, we're looking at the Israeli strike on Doha, the Israeli strike on Hamas leadership inside Doha a couple of days ago. And I think that is really the pivotal moment. We're seeing Israel show courage in its ability to target Hamas leadership outside of the Gaza Strip. And I think from the perspective of an analyst like myself, that was the turning point of this war, because it let Hamas know that they are not safe, but more importantly, it let the Arab states know that they cannot continue to enable and harbor Hamas. And that is the turning point of this war, because we're seeing the Arab states expend some pressure, some leverage on Hamas to accept this deal. Everybody wants a ceasefire. The Israelis want a ceasefire. The Americans want a ceasefire. The Arab states want a ceasefire. It is Hamas who wanted to wait out and get better conditions for a ceasefire. But allowing the Arab states, particularly Qatar and Egypt, to apply pressure on Hamas to accept a ceasefire at this critical moment is what we're seeing play out.
All right. Mariam, thank you so much for taking the time to join us as always and break it down. We love your analysis. Anything else that we missed? Anything you want to add here before I let you go? And I say we missed, but of course, this is a complex topic with a lot of different elements to it.
Absolutely. Last thoughts on my mind are watching how Hamas acts in the coming days. What will the hostage release look like? Will they abide by the ceasefire agreement? Or will they do what they have historically done, which is break ceasefire agreements and corner Israel back into a corner where they are to blame for publicly forcing the Israelis to take blame for a ceasefire falling through? It does not look like we are headed in that direction, but that will be important to watch in the coming days.
All right. Mariam, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We definitely appreciate it as always.
Thank you for having me.